This is one of the most isolated supermarkets on Earth. But it sure doesn't look like it. After all, it's in Hawaii, which, despite its name recognition and visitor count, is by most definitions the most remote major population center on Earth. There are more isolated islands and archipelagos and atolls, but nowhere on Earth is there a concentration of 1 million or more people farther from the next nearest concentration of 1 million. It's as far from Los Angeles as New York, as far from Anchorage as Norway, as far from Japan as Afghanistan. Between Hawaii and the California coast, there's truly nothing. No towns, no people, not even a single island of any size save for the few just off the coast of Los Angeles. The shortest commercial international flight from Hawaii is to a tiny atoll known as Christmas Island, populated by just 7,000 people, and that's an anomaly. The next nearest is to Majuro in the Marshall Islands, 4.5 hours away, but it's not until Fiji, a 6-hour flight from Honolulu, that the population comes even close to that of Hawaii. That's all to say, it's weird how normal this grocery store looks, considering where it is. Isolation typically restricts convenience, yet look inside and the shelves are stocked essentially exactly the same as they'd be if this was, say, a Safeway in Seattle. And not just with the shelf-stable products. Even these bananas originate from exactly where they would for most of the continental US. They've traveled from Ecuador so quickly, in fact, that they're not even ripe. It's not until one looks at the prices of perishables, $10 for a gallon of whole milk, that anything deviates from what would be the expectation on the mainland. Hawaii is firmly integrated in the American supply chain to the extent that differences in its retail landscape are surprisingly tough to come by. Dueling chicken retailers Chick-fil-A and Raising Cane's, for example, recently expanded to the state, both of which have next to no international presence and therefore no built-up international supply chains. Neither has an overwhelming incentive to expand to Hawaii. It is an untapped market, sure, but there's nothing about the state that would make it worth it for either to develop a brand new system of sourcing and shipping product just to open a couple dozen additional locations. So this is as good a sign as any that somehow these isolated islands are so logistically linked to the US that it's just about as easy for a brand to expand there as anywhere in the US. And it's true, Hawaii's supply chain offers a near seamless experience for its users, the shops, restaurants, and other businesses operating in the state. But the supply chain itself is anything but normal. Much of its uniqueness stems from one American law known as the Jones Act. Its rules are simple. With a little exception, only ships registered in the US, built in the US, and staffed by Americans can transport goods between US ports. The original idea was to protect the US merchant marine and shipbuilding industries, partially to keep competency in case major sealift capacity is needed for a large-scale war abroad, but these days this ends up being rather restrictive as the vast majority of ocean-going container ships are registered in countries with favorable tax and labor policies like Panama or Liberia, and primarily staffed by mariners from low-wage countries like the Philippines or India. What this means in practice is that the industry often ends up with exploitative labor practices, environmentally damaging construction processes, and other undesired externalities, but the end result is rock-bottom operating prices, a fraction of those of US ships. In fact, the cost of operating a Jones Act-compliant cargo ship is estimated between 3 to 6 times the norm. So in a free market, these ships simply wouldn't exist. They could never be competitive, if not for this law. The total number of Jones Act-compliant container ships in the entire world is just 23, and all but 5 of those are operated by one of 2 companies, Matson and Pasha Hawaii. This pair of companies represent the vast majority of inbound shipping capacity to Hawaii, and yet they likely would not exist if not for the Jones Act. That's because, even beyond the normally lower operating costs of international shipping companies, there's great asymmetry of demand across the Pacific. In September 2024, the average cost to ship a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Los Angeles was about $6,000, where shipping the same container on the same route in reverse, Los Angeles to Shanghai, cost just $700. That's all down to supply and demand. North America imports far more from Asia than Asia does from North America, so ships typically return west with far less. Hawaii is a rare instance of westbound demand across the Pacific, so if not for the Jones Act, some international shipping companies would likely add it as a stop on the return trip to Asia to drop off cargo on the typically unprofitable leg. But instead, Matson and Pasha Hawaii operate the services, charging far more to move the same 40-foot container. Now, their services do differ slightly from the global norm for container shipping, largely since, normally, container shipping is just not a very time-sensitive endeavor. Globally, cargo ships operate at an average speed of just 15 knots, despite a typical vessel top speed of over 20. This is since ocean shipping companies compete primarily on cost, not speed, and operating slower is more fuel efficient. Hawaii ships, meanwhile, typically operate at over 20 knots in order to transport goods to the state in just 3 or 4 days. Uniquely, these ships do compete on speed since they need to fit into the typical window of time it takes to get perishable products from distribution centers to stores. These bananas from Ecuador, for example, likely left the country on Dole's dedicated container ship, the Dole Pacific, up to their facility in San Diego. From there, they might otherwise spend a few days getting trucked to a grocery distribution center in, say, Salt Lake City, wait around for a day, then get trucked up to a grocery store in Missoula. So the route to Hawaii is not necessarily that much longer than that to an inland state. A day or two to get up to Matson's terminal in Long Beach, 4 days to get to Honolulu. West Coast ports like Long Beach and Oakland are major logistics hubs, and 3 to 4 day proximity to them is well within normal timeframes for distribution. What's less normal is the cost. Jones Act compliant operators have to pay high shipbuilding costs, they have to pay high labor costs, so they do what they can to reduce cost where possible. For example, on some sailings, they'll return to the West Coast at that slower, more efficient speed. On a recent trip, the Pasha George II left Long Beach on Wednesday, September 4th, sailed at 20 knots, then arrived in Honolulu 4 days later on Sunday. Following unloading and loading, it left Honolulu on Monday, but only sailed at about 15 knots and didn't get back to Long Beach until the following Monday, a week later. Hawaii doesn't export much these days, especially in terms of perishable goods, so this slower speed is fine. As another technique, Matson also services a unique route that helps capture eastbound demand and therefore maximize utilization as certain continue on to Guam. Guam is an American territory, and although it has far lower demand than Hawaii, both due to lower population and more international imports from nearby nations like Japan, it does still import plenty from the mainland. But after calling at Guam, Matson ships don't continue back to the US, they go on to the Japanese island of Okinawa, which also imports plenty from the US due to the massive US military presence there, before continuing on to Shanghai. There, the world's busiest container port, they've built a small niche as the provider of the fastest US-bound services. While most container traffic is not very time-dependent, on such a massive route, there's clearly some. For much of recent history, Matson was able to provide this speed because their ships are comparatively small. Shanghai naturally is a fairly shallow water port, so the larger ships used by competitors couldn't load to full capacity there, and therefore they typically make another stop to load fully before continuing on to North America. Shanghai has since artificially deepened its port, making this less so the case, but Matson still touts speed due to faster loading times from their smaller vessel size, full 20-knot operating speeds, and then on the US side, they operate their own dedicated terminals at ports like Oakland and Long Beach, allowing them to avoid the kind of port congestion that reached headlines during COVID. In fact, freight rates reached such astronomical heights during COVID that, despite their high operating costs, Matson could briefly, meaningfully compete, especially given their speed, and they took some capacity away from Hawaii to expand service from Asia. But now back in normal times, strategies such as their Asia service are increasingly crucial for Matson as they get used to competition. After all, for much of its history, Matson enjoyed a near-complete monopoly on Hawaii shipping services, and Pasha Hawaii's challenge since it first started service in 2005 has pushed prices down and introduced genuine competition for the first time in a while. But monopolies still exist in Hawaiian logistics. You see, every single container from the continental US first arrives here, at the port of Honolulu on Oahu. But Hawaii also encompasses Kauai, Maui, and the Big Island, plus a few other more minor islands. So to get containers beyond Honolulu, one must hire a barge, and there's one and only one company that offers barge service between the islands, Young Brothers. Now, Matson does operate its own barges that connect some of its containers that originated in the mainland to certain other Hawaiian ports, but the only carrier that is currently allowed by the state to sell container transport between the islands exclusively is Young Brothers. The logic behind this state-sanctioned monopoly is that Hawaii can therefore require Young Brothers to service unprofitable ports in sparsely populated Lanai and Molokai. And the state also regulates the rates Young Brothers charges, but there's still an eye-popping sum. Transporting a loaded container from Honolulu to any of the other ports, which typically takes about a day, costs $1,412.89, as in twice what shippers are currently charging to transport the same container from Los Angeles to Shanghai. And it's not like there are other Jones Act compliant barge operators that could replace Young Brothers' service at moment's notice, and the state knows this. When, in 2020, the company came to the state and said the rates they were allowed to charge would lead to a financial loss of $30 million, the state had essentially no option but to agree to a 46% hike in rates, lest risk losing their only way of getting goods between the islands. The state itself has admitted, in an audit of the company, that Young Brothers has gotten used to being able to pass on any increase in cost to the consumers, and therefore has little incentive to be diligent in reducing them. So when you combine the geography of isolation with federal and state legislation that restricts competition, one ends up with dramatically higher costs than those of the mainland. Compare the prices of the Whole Foods supermarket in Long Beach, California, closest to the port where much of Hawaii's goods originate, and that of the island of Maui. Now, one can find similar prices for certain shelf-stable goods. A bottle of olive oil is just $1 more in Hawaii, for example. But consistently, the fresher something is, the more expensive it is versus the mainland. Ground beef goes from $6.99 to $8.99. Cabbage from $1.49 a pound to $2.79. Lemons from 89 cents to $1.49. A pack of eggs from $3.69 to $5.99. As a state, Hawaii imports around 95% of its food. There is next to zero in-state production, and almost all of that food rides on one of two shipping carriers from the mainland, then one shipping carrier between the islands. There certainly are edge cases. A small portion of food gets flown in by plane, there are some imports from abroad, but in sum, there's incredible reliance on one single logistics system with uniquely, artificially high costs. But over recent years, state leaders have started to recognize that the downsides go beyond just costs. It's also just risky. You see, all mainland container cargo gets unloaded here at the port of Honolulu, with no exception. This is the only commercial port in the state that has the cranes necessary to unload the kind of large ocean-going cargo ships used by Matson and Pasha Hawaii. Those on the other islands are only capable of accepting and unloading smaller barges. So there's a single facility capable of bringing large quantities of goods into the islands, and it's on the coast. That means the fear is twofold: tsunamis and hurricanes. Either of these disasters could render the cranes used to unload ships inoperable, and even if they didn't, the ports are well within the possible inundation zones for either, meaning the surrounding infrastructure, like the roads used to bring containers out and staff in, could be flooded and damaged for an extended period. Having recognized this, the state did invest in a large portable crane capable of unloading containers, and that's stored at Pearl Harbor, the military base which is earmarked to operate as an alternate port in the event of Honolulu becoming inoperable. But estimates suggest this plan could only accommodate between 15 and 20% of normal cargo inflows, and as the recent incident at the Port of Baltimore demonstrated, disruption to port operations can last months. Of course, airports and roll-on, roll-off ships could provide a backstop for necessities in the event of major natural disaster, but the concentration of infrastructure in the port of Honolulu means that if it gets damaged or disrupted, it could take quite a while for life in Hawaii to get back to normal. But it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, it wasn't. Some 100 miles or 160 kilometers and 3 islands over from Pearl Harbor, along Maui's dry west coast, just north of the sunny Keaka Beach, and bumping up against the manicured landscape surrounding the undeniably aging Maui Paradise oceanfront condo, is what visitors describe as a pleasant wading pool or a shallow lagoon within which one can see small fish and turtles up close. But what these reviewers missed was the fact that this is not just a convenience for tourists, but a historical artifact. A physical explanation for how ancient Hawaii fed itself for centuries before European contact and centuries upon centuries before the advent of modern container ships. This is a coastal fish pond, one of about 360 that dotted the Hawaiian Islands at the time of James Cook's arrival in 1778, and one of the last vestiges of an intricate aquaculture structure that stretched from sea to mountaintop. Now, there's two major natural particularities that broadly define the Hawaiian Islands. First, as a rugged volcanic outcropping, the islands are generally mountainous, with high points on the larger islands ranging from a few thousand feet above sea level to well over 10,000 feet above sea level. Second, they don't receive precipitation evenly. The high country and the north and east sides receive feet upon feet of rain annually, while the dry southwestern sides measure their precipitation in inches. Faced with rugged uplands and flatter but drier lowlands, Hawaiian agriculture took shape around holistic watersheds, letting gravity do most of the work. Following streams gushing out from the higher elevation forests, Hawaiians would strategically dam or divert sections to flood fields for non-native taro, a carbohydrate-rich dietary staple. The growing taro, in turn, would provide food and shelter for fish such as mullet and silver perch, providing yet more food and nutrients. Water released from these catchments would then flow into lower freshwater ponds where freshwater prawn and sea-migrating fish would spawn. In turn, these nutrient-rich waters would then fill brackish ponds, then seawater ponds, connected by canals and separated by gates from the larger ocean that would let smaller fish in without letting bigger fish escape. With comparatively minimal alteration of the landscape, and with only the strength of a human workforce, Hawaiians, through aquaculture supplemented with animal husbandry and traditional agriculture, achieved sustainable food sovereignty. Of course, it goes without saying that such a system was in part made possible by a markedly different property ownership structure, a subsistence lifestyle rather than an extractive one, and a feudal organization of labor that's long been left behind. But it also showed that without much in the way of technology, and with the strategic use of non-native crops, Hawaii could sustainably produce food for a population that's been estimated to have touched 700 to 900,000 inhabitants at the time of Western contact. There are only remnants of this aquaculture system left today. The arrival of Europeans and Western disease decimated native populations, while Western interpretations of land use and property rights culminated in the 1848 Great Mahele, a legal transition of land ownership from a feudal regime into private property. Not far from Kihei, in the city of Lahaina, once a residence of King Kamehameha III, now a city rebuilding after unprecedented but entirely explainable wildfires, and one of these historically central ponds sat under an unspectacular park and some tennis courts. And not so far down the road, standing 225 feet in the air, is another artifact that largely informed the pond's destruction. While the Jones Act may explain why food is so expensive to import, it's sugarcane and pineapples that begin to explain why Hawaii has to import food in the first place. For a concentrated few, the proliferation of steam-powered ships, the advent of the California Gold Rush, then the American Civil War, and the newly established ability to purchase Hawaiian land in the mid-1880s proved a bona fide bonanza. With cheap land, cheap labor, minimal oversight, and maximum exploitation, the rich arable Hawaiian lowlands turned from food producers to cash crop producers as the only agriculture diversity stemmed from what was being monocropped: sugarcane or pineapples. Peaking in the 1950s, the plantation era dominated Hawaiian agriculture for more than a century, effectively turning a self-sustaining, sovereign food system into a cash crop exporter. But with statehood came increased regulation and labor rights, and with the jet age came increased accessibility. Suddenly Hawaii wasn't some vague American holding impossibly far away, but now a tropical destination that didn't require a passport. With stricter labor laws and higher wages, increased competition for real estate, and increasing competition abroad, monocropping slowly ceded economic centrality to tourism. With a growing population and an increasing visitor count, Hawaii now needed more food than ever, and yet, after a century of relentless exporting, could produce less than ever. While some small Hawaiian farms began to infill shuttering plantation lands, the cheapest, fastest way to keep the islands fed was importing. With beef imports, fruit imports, and vegetable imports all doubling from 1960 to 2000, the islands went from producing somewhere around half their own food to less than a tenth. This rather new system has started to have some real consequences. The Hawaiian cost of living crisis is severe. It is the most expensive state to live in by a wide margin, and food prices are far from all of it. The housing market is perhaps the biggest contributor to the state's woes, with an $840,000 median home price, which of course is also the highest in the nation. Estimates suggest that 44% of households in the state do not earn enough to pay for the absolute bare bones of necessities. After all, much of the work available is low-wage service sector jobs relating to the tourism industry. So in consequence, Native Hawaiians, the descendants of those who've inhabited the islands for a millennia, are packing up and leaving the state en masse. In fact, for the first time, the 2020 census indicated that the majority of Hawaiians now live not in Hawaii, but on the mainland. But at least, finally, there appears to be some recognition that the way Hawaii feeds itself is broken. Over recent years, the government in Honolulu has started to put a concerted effort into returning things to the way they were, or at least moving in that direction. And the timing is right. Dole's Oahu plantation stopped production in the 90s, and since has transformed into a tourist destination. Del Monte, another agriculture giant, finished its operations in the state in 2008, while Hawaii's last sugar mill, that of Maui, closed in 2016. So that means there are huge swaths of former plantation land now empty and available, and the state's trying to put it to use. Maui's former sugar plantation, for example, was purchased in 2018 by a company called Maui Pono, which has converted the fields into production of lemons, oranges, avocados, bananas, onions, and more. A diversified array of crops grown not for export, but rather to be inserted directly into the Hawaiian supply chain, hitting store shelves in Walmart, Costco, Safeway, and other retailers that otherwise would import from the mainland. And this fits into a concerted cross-government effort to convert plantation land statewide. But it's really too early to tell whether this is yielding results. There's just not enough data yet, and local food production also isn't, in and of itself, a direct solution to the issues presented by the state's current situation. The cost of labor is still extremely high, so in many cases the cost of locally grown goods might be at par with outside products. The decrease in transportation costs is counterbalanced with the increase in production costs. But it's a start. Incremental progress towards reversing a century of reliance on the mainland. It's really quite rare for a country to hold land so far from its core. There are some instances, but most countries' land is contiguous. It's rarer still for that land to be organized not as a territory, existing in some separated class and enjoying some higher level of autonomy, but rather as a fully integrated component of the country itself, in this case, a state. But even among those, Réunion, the Canary Islands, and perhaps a few others, it is rarer, perhaps unprecedented for land so far from the country's core to be so deeply integrated, politically, economically, and socially, with the rest of it. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that this isn't natural. It's a uniquely American thing to attempt to interlink itself with a series of islands so far away. In some ways, this has worked. Just look at the strip malls and fast food chains and big box retailers. But in actuality, Hawaii was not truly interlinked with the US. It was conquered. There was an equilibrium. Hawaii was a self-sustaining society until America came in and broke that tenuous balance. Decades upon decades of economic forces have compounded the effects, and today the state's in an unsustainable state. Food, housing, everything just costs too much compared to the wages earned in the state. There's not yet some grand solution. Even increased local food production will take ages to induce meaningful change. But at the very least, the state now recognizes the problem. The Hawaiian kingdom may never return, but Hawaiian self-reliance can. As far as American states go, Hawaii is just about one of the most difficult to research and write a fair and accurate script about. With a long, proud history as an empire itself, and an even longer history as an independent culture and society that still persists to this very day, navigating and understanding current trends and news events like the Lahaina wildfires without recognizing and thus replicating biases on how the rest of the US understands and often oversimplifies Hawaiian current events proved time-consuming. It only makes sense, though, that news outlets that rely on clicks to turn advertising revenues present tragedies like the Lahaina fire in incendiary and highly partisan ways. But there is a way to cut through this slant and the noise. That's Ground News, the sponsor for this video. By looking into the Lahaina fire with the help of Ground News, it becomes clear that the centrist and left-leaning outlets have spent more time covering the tragedy, the state's response to the tragedy, and the underlying routes of the tragedy, while the right has been practically silent on the topic. With such an imbalance in coverage between left and right, Ground News identifies the topic as a blind spot, which is one of my favorite features on the platform. With Blind Spot, users can see what stories aren't getting any representation in left or right-leaning news diets, and can go ahead and view subjects that are in their own blind spots, something that allows me to identify and take in news that otherwise wouldn't be surfaced in my own media diet. With Blind Spot, along with features such as bias ratings, factuality ratings, and information on media ownership structures, Ground News has helped me identify the limitations and leanings in my own media diet, while also helping me find sources for videos like this that I can really trust. If you'd like to more comfortably cut through the misinformation and political leanings of news stories and sources, go to ground.news/Wendover or follow the link in this video's description to try Ground News today and save 40% on your subscription. You'll become more savvy in your media consumption, and you'll support an independent news platform focused on factuality and transparency while you're at it.